So our first person for this morning is Dr. Wardell. He's already spoken at conference, and we've enjoyed his presentations already. But he is the Director of Pollination Operations for Wonderful Orchards. It's the largest almond pollinator in the USA. And he's also President of the South Valley Bee Club of California. And Gordon's accomplishments include megabee and years of research in terms of honeybees. So I'd like to welcome him to the stage. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Oop, stand closer. Good morning. Just make sure my phone is off here. I was at one meeting and the moderator said, make sure to turn your phones off or put it on vibrate, and I put my phone on vibrate. And a couple of beekeepers in the audience knew my number, and they just started calling it incessantly. And the thing kept vibrating and vibrating. So I turned it off now. All right, let me get my gear here. Almond pollen, I was just telling somebody in the back that I teach a class at Cal Poly University in California, and I teach an entire class pretty much based around almond pollination, so condensing it down into a few minutes here is going to be a challenge, but we'll get there. A lot of folks don't appreciate, and as beekeepers, I'm sure you get this a lot, especially the folks even in our office at Wonderful Orchards. They have the main office, and all the office people are in there, and the office is literally surrounded by orchards, and it's just beautiful. And the bees, are scheduled in usually around February 5th or so for almond pollination, and the workers will be there one day, and they come the next morning, and boom, the bees are there, and they say, wow, the bees arrived. It's like the bee fairies came, it just happened. And they don't appreciate that having those bees appear one day to the next, that evening, starting at dusk, beekeepers started getting in motion and worked all night long to have the bee fairies come and have those bees just appear. Until we started owning our own bees at Wonderful Orchards, people didn't appreciate the complexity and the dynamics of moving bees around the country and to pollination. So let's get into that a little bit here. It's the big dance, I call it. There's roughly 1 million acres of almonds in California in production this year. 1 million acres. That's an area the size of the state of Rhode Island. Not a big state in the United States, but it's a state. And it's a very large area, and it's spread out across the entire middle part of California. The reason so many almonds are grown in California because it's one of the best areas in the world to grow almonds. It has the right environment. Growing almonds is all about the environment. Enough moisture at the right time of year, and no moisture at the right time of year when you're trying to do your harvest. But also degree days of heating, and also chilling hours. Almonds are very particular when it comes to heating and cooling, and also California just happens to hit that Mediterranean climate with water coming down out of the Sierras that can irrigate most of the acreage, although even at Wonderful we're having trouble with enough water and had to pull out 10,000 acres of almonds. There's a number of challenges that of course face our bees and consequently challenge the almond industry, because almonds are the first crop to bloom in the year. And it's the same challenges that you face. Varroa mites, nosema disease. We even have robbing problems because we put our bees in large holding yards waiting to go into almonds. Viruses, fungicides, pesticides, all of these things impact our bees, as well as adequate nutrition, you'll see in a minute, and theft. We have a rising incidence of bee theft in the United States just before and during almond pollination because of the tight demand, and because you can get up to $200 per colony for pollination fees. And of course, weather is another big challenge that we have. Migratory patterns in the United States, moving bees around, used to be pretty simple. It was pretty much south to north. Beekeepers in Florida would winter down in Florida and then move north with the bloom as it moved north all the way up to, eventually up to Maine for blueberries and all, hitting apples, peaches, everything else in between. And Texas was the same way. Texas up to the Dakotas, and then California up to Washington State. That was our migratory patterns. And bees didn't really mix very much. We didn't, East Coast bees, bees didn't come across the Mississippi River. So disease issues weren't as big a problem. But today, our migratory patterns are dramatically changed. Once almond pollination went above $100 per colony, beekeepers started showing up from east of the Mississippi and wanting to get into the lucrative California gold rush of almond pollination. In the year 2000, let's see, in the year 1995, we had roughly 400,000 acres of almonds in California. Now we're hitting 1 million. And that means we need 2 million colonies of bees to pollinate that crop. 2 million colonies to pollinate the almond crop. We only have 2.4 million in the whole country, so that's 80% of our nation's bees, our nation's commercial bees, come from all over the country, as you can see on this map, come from all over the country to pollinate almonds in California. It truly is the big dance. You can see here the central coast of California is the primary area, the Central Valley of California rather, is the primary area of almond growing, all the way from Bakersfield and Taft up to Chico and above that area. It's an area that's roughly 500 miles long, right up the middle of the valley. There's over 6,800 growers who grow the almonds. Many of those are less than 100 acres. They're what we call ma and pa orchards. It's a very lucrative crop. What other crop can you plant and grow something and get 3,000 to 4,000 pounds of almonds that sell for $2 to $3 a pound, grossing you $4,000 to $6,000 per acre. That's not many crops can return that kind of a yield. So a lot of people want to get into almonds. There's a lot of dairies and other farms, and they're pulling out grapes in California to plant almonds because it takes less labor to manage the almonds than it does grapes. So it's a crop that's growing. There's more going in. You'd be surprised the number of sticks you see in the ground in California where they're still planting. Where are the bees going to come from? And this is what this slide depicts, is just the demand over time and the growth over time of the almond industry. And you can see the small green squares here in the bottom. These are acreage that's not bearing, that's going to be coming into bearing in the next 2 to 3 years. When a tree is planted, it usually takes about 4 years to come into bearing. Usually when it gets to what they call fourth leaf stage, does it start bearing, but they're still planting a tremendous number of almonds. And the price for almond pollination, because the acreage is growing and because the demand is getting greater, and we've got challenges with our bees, the price has gone up. You can see in the 1990s, price of almond pollination was about $40 and rising up to about $60, and then in 2005, 2006, skyrocketed. It doubled. In 1 year, it went from 60 up to over 100 because of the colony collapse disorder, whatever you want to call it. The demand that was being put on the bees couldn't take it anymore, and they just started dying. And those 2 years, there weren't enough bees to go around for the almond growers. Growers were happy to get 1 colony per acre instead of 2. And the beekeeping industry responded, came back, and changed their business style, their business models. And today, a lot of the commercial beekeepers in the United States produce very little honey and just produce bees. The business model, It used to be 1/3 of the beekeeper's income came from pollination and 2/3 came from honey. It's just the opposite today. 1/3 comes from honey and 2/3 comes from pollination and or raising bees and selling bees. So the whole model has changed. You can see that in the graph on the right-hand side, the price continues to increase. It's about 10% per year. Almond pollination fees go up about 10% per year. And last year we averaged about $180 per colony, with premium colonies, 10 and 12 frame colonies, going for $200 per colony. And even though you can see here the demand, you know, honey prices are going up and almond prices are going up, but the number of colonies in the country really hasn't changed that much. Beekeepers are making more bees today in the United States. We're making more splits. Instead of making honey, we make splits, use that honey to make more bees, but we're losing 40% of our population annually to die-off. And what is causing it? I call it the 4 Ps. I talked about that earlier: parasites, pathogens, pesticides, and a lack of pasture. We've lost 25% of our CRP land, the land that's set aside where land is just allowed to grow into natural forbs and bee forage. That land is being turned into corn and soybean production, and it's being lost to bee pollination. And the other issues that are challenging the bees that everybody is having problems with are queens and mites and other issues like that that are just causing us to lose more bees than we really want to. You can see the 10% increase per year in the pollination fees, and the demand. Demand is increasing here where the supply, and eventually the two are going to cross. I mean, you don't have to be a Keynesian economist to figure that out. Eventually they're going to cross, unless we figure out, you know, how to manage our bees better and keep our bees healthier and not lose as many. Why do almonds need bees? Well, almonds are not self-fertile. Most almond varieties are not self-fertile. You have to plant 2 or 3 different varieties in an orchard in order to get cross-pollination that's necessary to pollinate the tree. It's, if you will, the row here on the right, pollen has to be taken from that row over to the row on the left in order to do cross-pollination. And the only thing that will do that, of course, is an insect, a bee. So we use our bees to effect this pollination. There is a new variety of almonds come out called Independence variety, and it's self-fertile. It's not self-pollinating. I mean, many times you see it misreferenced in the literature that it's a self-pollinating almond, but they've done studies where they've netted the trees, keep the pollinators away from it, and the Independence variety is self-fertile, but the pollen still does not go from the anther over to the pistil without some help. And I promise this is the last time I'll use that bee. But I have to have some animation in my talks. But you have to have an insect move it across. So when they netted these trees and excluded the bees, they got almost no almonds on those trees. So you have to have bees. And so the bees have to come from all over the country, and we load them up on semi-trucks and literally bring them over 2,500 miles across the country, taking 3 and 4 days of travel time to bring them across. They're put on trucks like this, netted on top of on the top of the stack. We put soaker hoses, so when the truck driver stops, he can hook it up to a hose outlet, a hose bib, and run water on it and water the bees in the truck by letting the soaker hose drip water down the stack of colonies. And it's not always easy. It sounds pretty easy. I'll just throw them on the truck and put them across the country. But it's not always that easy. This is our loading yard at Wonderful down in Florida. We had 2 days of rain, 6 inches of rain in just one day. And our loading yard literally became a lake. And we had to move our bees up off of the pallets they were on onto stacks of 2 and 3 pallets just to keep them out of the water. And as we moved our bees up out of the water and onto high ground so we could load them on trucks to get them out to California to pollinate the almonds, the fire ants came up on the pallets as well. And that's one of the challenges we have moving insects across the country. California has a $12 billion a year agricultural industry, and they don't want to have a lot of pests imported, just as you don't. You don't want pests imported to New Zealand. California is the same way. And we had to do a lot of remediation to get the ants off of our boxes to be able to put them on the trucks. So we had to pressure wash pallets, move the bees off of the existing pallets that they were on, move them onto new fresh pallets, and at the same time have a crew of 2 and 3 fellows sweeping down each individual hive to make sure there weren't ants on it as they moved it onto the clean pallet. It took days. And then we get eventually to the inspection station, and then we have to go through the California State Inspection, where they can take anywhere from 2 hours to 2 days to inspect the load of bees to make sure that it's free of pests and parasites, so they're not bringing fire ants or other insects into California. We don't want to bring fire ants in. As beekeepers or as growers, we don't want to have them because one is health issues, attacking people in the orchards, but also the ants the ants eat the nuts when they're on the ground as they're drying, so we lose a lot of crop. So we want to keep the ants out too. We had, I think, 2 or 3 trucks held up this year for more than a day, but none of the trucks had to be turned away. They just had to be washed, which is an interesting process. They had to take all the bees off of the truck, wash the bees and the pallets and the colonies with high pressure water, and then load them back on. And you can imagine, and re-net it, and you can imagine you lose a lot of bees in the process. So a 10-frame hive can be taken down to an 8-frame or 6-frame hive in the process. But it's all part of the dance you have to do to get there. But there's about 4,000 trucks a year that enter California hauling bees doing this. Roughly 1.8 million hives of bees are brought into California. There's roughly 200,000 resident colonies in California that don't leave the state. The rest of the bees come in from out of state. I know probably somebody was asking, well, why don't in California just do your own pollination? It's just it's not possible. So after the bees get in, then it's the process of taking the nets off and offloading the bees. And if you're coming in early, if you're coming out of the northern tier of states, out of the Dakotas, Montana, Michigan, New York, Maine, you have to come in early and put your bees in holding yards. Much like this one. This is out near my laboratory. Each one of those circles, you can see here, each one of these circles is a truckload of bees, 440 colonies on pallets. And the beekeeper who has these bees brings in roughly 40 to 50,000 colonies every year, and he puts most of them in this one holding area. It just goes on as far as the eye can see. Beehives in circles, crop circles of bees, if you will. And it's really difficult to manage bees in a situation like this. You can see it's brown. There's no food out there. So all the bees are being fed protein supplements and sugar syrup on a monthly basis. They go through and put on 8 to 10 pounds of supplement. They literally fill up a feeder lid with protein supplement, dump it on top of the hive, and fill up an inboard feeder with 2 gallons of syrup. And crews do that 7 days a week for 3 months. When the bees come in October, they're fed all the way until February, until they go into the almonds. It's truly phenomenal. So the bees come off the trucks, they get positioned out, and then they wait to go into almonds. And so this is a time when you're literally managing your bees, hoping that you don't have big problems. And this November, December time is critical, because that's when our biggest die-off happens. Weather is chilly in California, but not real cold, but it can drive down the temperatures, and bees can have a problem. Many of the beekeepers are pushing their bees really hard and not letting them harden up for winter. In my last talk, I talked about developing fat bees, you know, those winter bees, how you have to let the bees have a break and let the queen have a break, so you get a higher nurse bee to brood ratio, so you have more nurses than brood, and the bees then internalize all that extra protein that the bees are getting and produce fat bees. A lot of beekeepers aren't allowing their bees at downtime, and consequently they're producing what I call summer bees, bees that live about 6 weeks. So in California, if you hadn't hardened your bees up, you're going to have bees dying off in December and January before you get to almond pollination, just because the bees aren't living as long as they need to, and you're not rearing as many as you need to. So the bees are in the orchard, and I think this is a little out of sequence, but there's once the orchards start blooming, the bees start bringing in pollen. And the pollen the bees are bringing in, this is one day in a pollen trap in almonds. It's just phenomenal, the amount of protein that the bees can bring in a day. And they love almond pollen, and it is a monoculture. There's not much else blooming out there at that time, but it really is a good pollen for bees. Frank Eischen, USDA researcher out of Texas, this was him collecting pollen in the orchard to take back to Texas, and he put bees out in the desert where they couldn't get any other pollen and fed them on almond pollen for over 3 months. And there was no difference between the performance on almond pollen as opposed to feeding a polyfloral pollen, many sources of pollen all mixed together and fed to the bees. He saw no difference at all in the two. So almond really is a good pollen for bees, and even though it is a monocultural source, bees do very well on it, and they pack it away, and it really is a product that helps the bees go on. And a lot of beekeepers coming out of almonds will split their hives because they're so healthy after almond pollination. But we're looking at ways to support the bees before the almonds bloom, and planting supplemental forage is one of those things. I know you folks have trees for bees where you're planting hedgerows and that sort of things for bees. We don't have the hedgerows, but we do have open fields, and we're putting in seeds. And if we get enough rain, depending on the year, if we get enough rain, we can grow these supplemental forage for the bees that bloom before almonds and help the bees over that hill of getting ready for almond pollination and the dearth that they're in just before almonds. Bees perform much better in almonds if they have some brood and are coming up. So we're looking at how to support the bees during there. And there's a lot of flowers that will bloom before almonds, so if we can get enough water to them. We are in a 5-year drought in California. There hasn't been enough rain really to grow a lot of these supplemental forages, but we do. This last year we got a couple inches of rain in January, and that was enough to grow these flowers you see here. So at Wonderful Orchards, we bring in, we used to bring in roughly 90,000. We're down to 70,000 colonies now that we bring in to pollinate our 46,000 acres of almonds. And in the pollination, we want to support the beekeeper. We want to and support the beekeeper in bringing in stronger colonies to us. So we pay on a scale, a floating scale for the bees. We have a base rate. This last year was $175 base rate for an 8-frame average, 6-frame minimum colony at February 1st when they bring them in, which is not easy in the winter. And then if the colony is bigger than 8 frames, if it's 9 or 10 frames, we add an additional $7.50 per frame. And then if it's even larger than that, 11 or 12 frames, we add $5 for each frame above 11. So if a beekeeper brought in a 12-frame average, which most of our beekeepers did last year, brought in a 12-frame average, they would walk home with $200 per colony, which we think is fair for bringing in the stronger colonies. We have crews that go out. We train crews every spring, and crews go out and do the inspection of the colonies and grade the colonies. And they figure out how many frames of bees are in the colony. We don't care about brood. We just do a California inspection, we call it, and it's just looking for the number of frames that are 2/3 covered with bees. So this is our grading program I told you about, and all of this data is put into handheld devices that communicate with the main computer at the company, and what we get is a mosaic built. They put the data in and it immediately downloads to the main computer, and these are ranches, and the darker the green, the stronger the colonies, and when it starts getting pink and red is when they're getting very weak. So you can see some here that in this area there were some colonies that just weren't up to par. So when I'm riding around in my truck, I can monitor the inspections as they're going on because I have 4 crews of guys out inspecting, and I can monitor the different inspections, and when I see a problem like this arising, I can go there, take a look myself, and then call in extra bees to make sure we get adequate pollination. And you'd think, well, okay, they're not 8 frames or 10 frames, but they're 4 and 6 frame bees. What's wrong with that? Isn't that going to give you good enough pollination? Well, we did some studies, and we looked at the impact of number of frames of bees on yield in the almonds. And you can see here, this is year 2012. It was a rather cool year. It wasn't a great year for pollination. A little bit rainy, not as many flight days. And you can see here going from 6 frames up to 12 frames here, you can see the difference in the number of pounds of almonds per acre. So as colony strength increased, we were getting more on a routine basis across the company. We were getting more almonds per acre. So size does matter. 2013 was a little warmer year, better year for flying, and the line flattened out a little bit, but there's still an increase as the colony size increases. On average, yield increases. And then again, in 2014, it was even a better year, and the line's even more flat, and you can see the points aren't as distinct, but there is a difference. So that's why we inspect. The other challenge we have in almonds is getting good bees in and then keeping them healthy. Let's see if I've got, it's coming up. Here it is. In 2014, we had over 80,000 colonies. It was a great year for pollination. Good weather, great flight weather, great flying times. The bees did great. Unfortunately, we had over 80,000 colonies in California that were killed or damaged severely by pesticide and fungicide application, and most of it was tank mixes, mixing fungicides along with insect growth regulators and a bunch of other adjuvants that we really are still looking at, but it damaged a bunch of colonies. And in response to that, this is a picture of a aerofan going through the orchard in the middle of the day, spraying. And in response to that, I worked with the Almond Board of California, and the California beekeepers worked with us, and we developed these best management practices to work with the growers to educate them about keeping the bees healthy and what it takes to keep the bees healthy during bloom. About, the communication chain is the biggest thing. If you communicate with the growers and the grower communicates with the beekeepers and we know what's going on, there's less chance of damage being done. And also, we're letting the growers know that insect growth regulators don't affect the adult bees, but they kill the brood. In 2015, we went from 80,000 colonies being killed down to less than 500 being killed during bloom. And that was accidental spray drift from a grape orchard or grape vineyard or something like that. So the growers really responded and came around and changed their models. And one of the things they started doing was spraying at night. If they had to put fungicides on, only put on what you have to put on and do it at night so you're not impacting the bees. Spraying during the middle of the day does nothing but take the bees out of the air. And why would you pay $200 an acre and then not let the bees do the job they're being paid for? So, and it's just education that needs to be done. This is another incident where bees were killed and this is what insect growth regulator damage looks like. It interrupts the pupation of the bees, and the bees aren't able to emerge from the cells, and you find a bunch of pupae thrown out the front door that weren't able to develop. And this is pretty much stopped. This is another spray incident. We're working with growers on this. It's spraying glyphosate or herbicides. This grower was very proud that they started raising their own bees. They had 500 colonies of their own personal bees that they had raised. They put them out in the orchard, and they ran through and sprayed glyphosate, weed killers. And they called me up and they said, "Gordy, we got a problem. Can you come and take a look?" And I looked, and what they had done is they mixed different herbicides along with spray oil and ammonium sulfate. And they turned the sprayers up on the end of the rig so it would go under the trees, but they didn't turn it off when they went past the hives, sprayed right into the entrance to the hives. Oops. And he said, "Oh, I thought this stuff is safe around bees." And I said, "Safe around bees, not safe on bees. There's a difference." So we've got growers now turning the rigs off when they get close to the hives to protect the bees. It's all things that we can do to help make it safe. The one thing that at Wonderful Orchards we stopped spraying because we found that the fungicides are damaging the stigmatic surface. This surface right here on the top of the pistil is where it has to receive the pollen. And this is pictures of micrographs of a healthy stigmatic surface. When sprayed with fungicides and a lot of the adjuvants that are out there, the stigmatic surface starts to melt. And it can't receive a pollen grain anymore. It can't tell the pollen grain the message that it needs to tell it to put its pollen tube here. So learning this, we stopped spraying altogether, and a lot of growers are now doing the same thing. They're stopping the spraying during bloom because it's just another way to decrease your yields. And we have much more creative ways to do that than do this. So anyway, this is what the stigmatic surface looks like when it's damaged, and we don't want to do that. But ultimately, keeping bees healthy during almond pollination is critical because from almonds, these bees in the United States literally go all over the nation and produce 1/3 of our nation's food after almonds, because almonds is the first crop of the year. It's the crop that the bees work on and then move on to other crops after that. And our agriculture is dependent on it, so it's really critical that we keep our bees healthy during almond pollination. This is blueberry pollination up in Maine. A lot of the colonies that go to California will leave California and then go up to Maine. Over 200,000 colonies go to Maine for blueberry pollination in low bush blueberries. Just a fascinating crop, and it's really a wild crop that's managed. So that's what I've got about almond pollination. I'd be happy to take any questions if anybody has any questions. All right. Oh, here's one.
Thank you. Quite a staggering presentation for those of us in this small country. The question of, you talked about the spraying during the daytime using the fungicides and herbicides, obviously, by the sound of it. And I wondered if do you go and get into discussions with the growers on the use of surfactants as well, being an absolute complete knockdown additive as far as flying bees go?
We do. You know, that's one of the things that I stress with the growers is that the easiest way to kill a bee is to spray it with soap and water, because the soap breaks the surface tension of the water, and when it coats the bee, it just literally gets sucked into the spiracles, the breathing tubes of the bees, and suffocates them. So by spraying soapy water, you know, by surfactants in water in the air during the day when the bees are flying, you're literally knocking those bees that you're paying a lot of money for out of the sky. And the other thing that it does is, well, some of the surfactants, especially the organosilicones, vector viruses they erode the cuticle of the bee, allow viruses and other things to attack the bee more readily. And it's just, you know, there's a lot of work done. Marianne Fraser, I think she was here last year, did a lot of work on organosilicones and the impact as a surfactant, what they have on the bees. So we ask our growers to use a non-ionic surfactant, and it's really improved, you know, the impact on the bees, and spraying at night helps as well. So yeah, very good.
Just a comment. You said that 1/3 of your beekeepers are doing honey.
Right.
And 2/3 are doing pollination. Well, I believe it's probably the opposite in this country. It's exactly, you know, we're all chasing honey now. So, and you are getting losses of something like 40%.
Right.
Why are your beekeepers doing your pollination in New Zealand dollars about $282 a hive? Why are they doing it so cheap? Or they just take them, is that just one crop? They take it from one crop to the next crop to the next crop? Or
right.
do they take the bees out and get honey afterwards? They must have to make more than that to survive.
It's not 1/3 of our beekeepers. I may have misstated there. About 1/3 of their income comes from honey, and 2/3 comes from pollination. Beekeepers will still be making honey, but not as much honey as they used to, because they're making more splits. The honey they're making goes into splits. Why they're selling their bees so cheap, why they're renting pollination so cheap? Well, almonds isn't the cheapest. It's the most expensive. But then after that, the beekeepers will go to things like blueberries, which they'll get roughly $120 to $140 per colony for blueberry pollination, and then they can go to apples after that, and so on. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Interesting, there's 50,000 beehives, whatever, in that dump site, and they're feeding. How do they control? It must be some massive robbing. I mean, how do you control robbing in such a big site?
Well, reduce the entrances. All the entrances have to be reduced. And it's interesting when they go through and start feeding, they have one fellow that goes through and flips the lid on that whole circle. He flips all the lids at one time. And all the bees then stay home and protect their colony instead of going out and trying to rob somebody else. If you go through and just hive by hive and open the hive up and feed, you get the bees following you and robbing as you're going through. But if you flip all the lids at one time, they become defensive. Everybody stays home.
But you can't flip 50,000 beehives at once.
No, it takes a whole month to go through 50,000. They have a crew of 18 guys that do it.
Would you work at night? That we control your robbing, wouldn't it?
They work, many times they'll work at night if they're not getting their stuff done, yes.
Thank you.
Okay.